Hi, I'm Keith, and yes, Esper is a software company. And what self-respecting software company would dive into the world of the operational model for dedicated device fleets? Because it's really, really important, and you have to think it through, address it up front, and have a smooth flow all the way through because we're focused on customers, and the operational model is absolutely critical for dedicated device fleets. So we're going to jump into that today. So come and join me, have some fun. Hi, I'm Keith Szot, VP of Innovation and Solutions at Esper, and you're watching Fleet Geek. Build your dedicated device fleet your way. Operational model. It's funny, you talk to a software developer and they're like, what? We don't care about the operational model. But if you're in IT, having to roll out and support these devices, it's basically your life. And so this is a really important aspect to consider as you do your dedicated device fleet. I will make a note that we're not going to talk about the case where you're actually developing a device or a piece of hardware. You can consider that there's a set of planning and execution that frankly is more complicated that happens before where I will start today. Perhaps it'll be a topic of a different video, but this makes the assumption that you have an existing piece of hardware that you've identified that you plan to build your fleet around. Could be a diverse set of devices, but the key point is that you're not commissioning or in the process of designing and manufacturing or getting that device manufactured yourself. So with that, let's jump in. So the first stage is what I call designing the solution. And you're like, well, of course we're going to design the solution. But this is where you really need to think about the nuts and bolts of operating your fleet. And are there any considerations with that? Like, where are you deploying? Can you get to the devices? What are the capabilities of your end users on the other end? What kind of money do you have to work with? Can you afford to do a truck roll? Can you not afford to do it? Is it an unattended device in the field? Are humans using it? So there are a lot of things that go into the consideration when you're designing the solution relative to the operation that you have to enumerate, work through, consider as you do it. Then the next part is, well, staging. And so what this is if you're taking a piece of hardware, how do you prepare and configure it for deployment? Some of it could be physical, meaning you have a set of peripherals that go with your device. Let's say if you're going into retail, you'll probably have a credit card reader, you may have a printer, you may have a cash drawer. So those peripherals are a very important part when you think about staging and what you need to do to prepare. This also comes to configuration of the device. So this is where Esper comes in. What is the specification for what you want to achieve with that device? What can you do out of the box without any special work to get the device to the state that you want to get it into? At Esper, we actually work on that a lot because adapting off-the-shelf hardware sometimes requires some special configurations, even working with a device maker to be able to make some changes to how the device behaves to get it to what you want to for your particular use case. Then there's a software load. How do you make sure that you get the right set of APKs on the particular device? Again, Esper comes into play here because this is what we call provisioning. And so these are the techniques to basically prepare the device on site so that you can deliver it to your deployment location. But there are different ways of doing it, right? So staging at a site, and 3PLs, if you know that term, third-party logistic providers do a lot of this for you. But at the other extreme, there's dropship. And what that means is if you're working in a commercial business venue, can you deliver that device directly to the deployment location and have it unboxed and installed at the extreme by one of the employees at the deployment location? We have customers that do this. There are lots of different ways that you can do this. One aspect of it is our seamless provisioning that we support through Foundation, our Android OS variant. And that can save a lot of time and money, but that does require that you have some information ahead of time. What are the serial numbers of the device? Do you have the inventory control to know that the device that you ship to a deployment location that needs to be prepared in a certain way, you have that serial number and you don't get them mixed up, because this whole scheme is driven by serial number. We actually have some customers that don't operate that way, and they would prefer to have a warehouse where they can pick a box or pick a device, ship it to the customer, and they actually use, since they're GMS devices, 6-tap QR code. They provide the QR code to the customer, they snap it, they're willing to trust the customer that they'll take it through the enrollment process, get it done, and it saves them a lot of money because they keep out of staging through a 3PL. So it completely depends on what your business is, who you're working with, what's your deployment strategy. So you really need to think through this part, because it does have implications on technology choices that you make, and specific with Esper, how you approach using our technology stack to be able to prepare those devices and ship them out to their deployment location. And this is also with development too. So there could be implications to what you do with your app that relate to this. So depending on how you want to deploy, how do you bind that app to your cloud? Do you want to do it at the time of staging for a particular account? Is it the kind of thing where you provide credentials to the user on the other end and they log in? So this one typically isn't as heavy because there are standard ways that you're going to do it, but you should think about this in terms of the overall flow, because staging is going to be really important, and then thinking about how you operate it. This goes back to, well, what if you lose Wi-Fi connectivity and you're dependent on that? How through your app or your experience can you get to Wi-Fi settings to be able to change it? Esper can help there as well with our Esper settings app. But these all kind of bundle together, and they need to be thought through and planned for before you go into execution. All right, now that you're done with design, well, you're going to want to develop and build this thing. So dev and build. So in a way, it's like revisiting some of the concepts that we talked about here, because you have made decisions and now you're going to start to operationalize it. So you're going to build your app, and you're going to do it off of what you decided to do based on the planning phase. You're going to prepare for your staging. And so it's things like, if you decided to go with seamless provisioning, you're going to work with your device manufacturer or whoever you're purchasing the devices from to make sure that you either have the serial number or the IMEI, depending on the device type, that you can load into the Esper system. You're going to map it to the config that you want to create. If you're drop shipping, then you have to take that extra step to know exactly where you're shipping it to and have that tracking in place, so that way you don't mess it up and ship the wrong device to the wrong deployment location. Or you can go with a more agile form using QR code to make it easier for you. Or one of the other methods we support, like Knox Mobile Enrollment, Google Touch Zero Enrollment, Android for Work. So it's really up to you, taking what you decided to do and put it into play. And also to basically prototyping it to make sure that you actually understand that flow. And the benefit of that is you can get things through faster. You get better economics around preparing those devices. We've done this kind of operation before for customers where they present to us their staging plan. So basically they document up all the steps without Esper. We love coming in and saying, that 10-page doc, we can make it half a page. And that 40-minute flow time through staging, we can make 5 minutes. So it's very important for you to think through what that operational flow is, and then look for places that you can optimize that make economic sense for you with a trade-off. Maybe you want to spend the time there and you want to spend the money because it's worth it for the end experience that you're trying to deliver, and it will benefit you in other parts of your overall operational flow. But there are cases where you can save money when you do this staging. And then it's making sure that you're taking advantage of the full tech stack available to you. And so we talk about build the app, we talked about planning around dev. This is where you put our device SDK to work. And so through this, you can fetch the serial number of the device, which you can't typically do as an APK in Android 10 and above. And through that, you can have exact coordination between the instance of your app on the device and your cloud, so you exactly know which human or which deployment location is working with that device. And you can take advantage of that knowledge, that information, to create a superior experience as well as better operational flow by being able to do that coordination through the device SDK. That's just one of the things you could do So it kind of goes back to know your infrastructure in the plan, and then make sure that you apply it as you build your solution and you do your development work. This also includes, we talked about staging, but it's also validation, like field trials, which are very important to do. Get it out in the real world, get some feedback, so that way, before you go to scale, you worked out the kinks associated with deploying your solution, running your solution. So you definitely need to test and POC here. Once you have that done, let's go to the really fun part next. Okay, so now we actually go to stage. Stepping on the stage, or staging. So the key part here is you gotta know where you stage. And so if you use a 3PL, if you're doing it at your own site, if you're doing it on site, and it is impacted by these decisions that you made in the design and in the dev and build with the POC, because you're gonna learn things. But there are minimum requirements that you need to think about. Like one common one that we run into is an inadequate internet connection available at the staging site. It depends on how big your app is, what your throughput is, because the ability to basically get the APKs down through that internet connection is going to limit your throughput through staging. And so it can back you up, it can slow you down. But there are techniques that you can use to improve the situation. We actually have one that you should talk to us about, which is local caching of your APK on the intranet, so it doesn't need to go through the pipe. But that can introduce other issues, like weird ones. For instance, we had a situation where there was a leasing issue with IP addresses. So the IT department for where it was being staged set it up so that if a device popped up and grabbed an IP address, it would hold it for 24 hours. And they were moving so many devices through staging that they actually ran out of IP addresses. And they discovered that once they were in the heat of the battle. So that's probably something to check, which is your overall IT infrastructure. If you're using Wi-Fi or even Ethernet, do you have a sufficient number of IP addresses for your flow rate? So there's some math there. There's like a spreadsheet that you can build to kind of figure that out, and make sure that that staging infrastructure is ready to go. So this is where you start to think about the different trade-offs. Well, how much is staging going to cost? How much are you willing to spend? What kind of flexibility do you need here? Is this a one-shotter for you? Or are you going to be going back to do batches through staging, and that's going to impact your choices that you make up here? Are you going to be staging at the factory? So this goes back to, there are some certain situations where if you're purchasing directly from a manufacturer in Asia, you can actually set up with them that they can prepare it to your specifications so that when it arrives, it's ready to go. Again, it depends on your scenario and your use case, and you should really think about that as you design your solution. But it's possible to have it like delivered, ready to be deployed, and that can be done with Esper quite well, actually. So we do that with ODMs. For some customers who are using Esper, they can define the configuration in the cloud, and basically it just automatically gets pulled to the device via serial number over in China. And so from the ODM's perspective, all they have to do is light it up, connect it to the internet, and off they go. Connecting to the internet can be a problem, though, with the Great Firewall. And so that is a question that if you're going that route, talk to your ODM about it. Can they do it or not? And there are intermediate ways to be able to accomplish this. It gets a little bit more complicated, but this is kind of the extreme. And so depends on how you're deploying and what you're trying to do there. I would characterize it, though, of something that I call the UBI, because really what staging is setting up is what out-of-box experience do you want for your end user at the deployment location. If it's an unattended device like a kiosk, well, your UBI is the technician setting it up, so you don't particularly care. If you're delivering a tablet to remote patient monitoring, to an elderly person in the home, UBI really matters. And so it goes back to that trade-off that perhaps if you have a tech at the other end, you don't spend as much money here because they're going to be on site anyway and they can perform those operations. You got a minimum pay, if you will, minimum time that they're going to be there. So just kind of load it towards that end. But with an elderly person using a healthcare-based device, you're probably going to want to take care of as much as you can here so that they have a very crisp boobie, because it's going to cause customer dissat and probably cost you more money for that support loop you're going to have to do to take care of them if you don't get the boobie right. All right, so that's staging. Why don't we go to next, which is deployment. All right, next is deploy. All right, so you got to deploy these devices, and I do a side because like this could be some of the hard stuff, right? It's like if you're using Wi-Fi, how the heck do you handle Wi-Fi credentials? You know, we'll take the example that I talked about with the UBI working with the elderly. Are you going to want them to enter Wi-Fi credentials into that device? Well, they kind of have to if they need to be able to use it. So think through that model, because typically there is either a caregiver or a younger family member that takes care of them. Can you bake that in? Because if you use Wi-Fi, you get superior economics, and you don't have to worry about cellular coverage. But that takes me into cellular coverage, because we've seen the scenario where, hey, you provide cellular in there because it gives you the best out-of-box experience, because you already have it prepared at staging, activated, and it just works when the consumer gets it. And then you figure out how to get those Wi-Fi credentials in, so that way you save yourself some money so you're not chewing up cellular data at the same time. It does also go to, if you're in like a corporate scenario or a business scenario, firewall. Firewall, always fun. Now in SMB, you typically don't run into this. And if you do run into it at kind of like the enterprise or the larger customers, it's usually fairly uniform. So it kind of goes back to, well, you should, in the earlier stages, understand what your deployment environment is, so you know what the firewall setup is. But the software infrastructure that runs on these devices that talks to the cloud needs to have the precise allow list, so that way they will work when they're dealing with this firewall. And there's definitely a loop, and sometimes that loop can be rather long, that you work with an IT department and also your supplier to figure it out. So we're very experienced with this. It's always kind of different and fun every time, but we get through it and ensure that the device can properly talk to the internet so that the solution can work. And then once you deploy, you need to make sure it's all good. And so this is almost your out-of-box experience, and how do you make sure that that initial deployment is flowing in the way that it should? That's why Esper is great, because essentially we give you the bird's eye view of every device that is out there in your fleet. And it gives you a great way remotely to make sure that that out-of-box experience for you, that is the out-of-box experience for the end user, is crisp and good. All right, now we're going to do the last one, and I'm going to put it at the top because it is operational, right? It's you operate these devices in the real world. And so this kind of gets into the block and tackle of like, how do you monitor the devices? How do you update configs? How do you change them when they're in the field? You know, this all is stuff that Esper does. How do you roll out app updates? This is the meat and potatoes of our infrastructure for you and the key for our DevOps for devices. So this is things like our new blueprints, so that you can find the template for what the devices should be for a particular deployment topology. This is how you can monitor drift to make sure that anything that is a variant that you can address at your choice, at your leisure. But this is also going to the reality that sometimes devices fail. Now the classic is you have a tablet that got dropped. You're going to have to do a swap out. And so you have to consider how you do that, how that's handled. If you do a swap out, are you going to rework these devices? Do you have a rework bench? Do you have a partner that will do that to repair them? Or are you just going to recycle them? And so that is sensitive to the business model. If you're doing a commercial off-the-shelf tablet, you're probably just going to get rid of it. But that also then goes into, well, what is your supplier warranty? Can you get something from the vendor that will soften the blow, if you will, in terms of the cost that you take? And so you should think about that stuff. And by the way, that goes up front, which about designing the solution. Again, I skipped the hardware part, but that's out here when you're deciding your hardware that can bleed over into when you're designing your solution. So that is the flow. There's a lot up there. Love to talk to you all about this. If you are planning a dedicated device fleet, obviously we've lived through this for many different use cases, many different verticals. So I think we can have some interesting insights for you. And if you want to go on your own with this, just kind of squint through this and maybe this will be helpful. I don't know, but thanks for your time.